Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, filling in for Fimi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, kidnapped, smuggled across borders, and sold into forced labor. This is the reality for millions of children around the world. We speak with a survivor. Filling in for me as digital producer is our very own Omar Badar. Omar, I know this is something that affects so many people around the world.
It does, and it's not just something that you have to be an investigator to see. I mean, it's essentially something forced child labor and child labor in general is something that our community is seeing all the time. If you take a look at my screen here, Ghulam from Pakistan says, yes, from department stores to an auto mechanic shop, majority of parents forcefully involve their kids in this. We have Yahya here from Nigeria who says, yes, it is all over the place here. It seems like a traditional thing and it's deeply rooted. Then we have this tweet from the US also. One tweet says that during his visit to West Africa and Benin, he says plenty of children are working on site construction for private homes. Of course, we want to know why this is happening and what can be done to stop it. So we want to hear from our community online. Be sure to tweet in using the hashtag AJStream and we'll get to your feedback.
Now, if you have a story you'd like to see us discuss on the stream, let us know. Go to Google Plus and tell us about your idea, and it could end up in the stream.
I'm Harsh Gupta. I'm a public policy columnist based in Singapore, writing about India, and I am in the stream.
Without any hope of returning home, more than 5 million children around the world have been trafficked into forced labor. That's according to the International Labor Organization. In conflict zones, children are especially at risk of being sold to armed groups, often to participate in military conflict. In some instances, the child is peddled by their own family for money or to pay off a debt, as most of the victims come from poor or marginalized communities. Often the children end up in sweatshops working for little or no pay, making many of the products we use daily. Take a look at a clip from this campaign by World Vision Canada.
No child should ever be for sale.
That hits home. With July 30th marking the first ever day of trafficking in persons, what can put an end to the forced labor of children? Joining us to discuss this via Skype from Olympia, Washington is Rani Hong, a survivor of child trafficking and one of the world's leading voices in the fight against modern-day slavery. In Nepal is Jeffrey Blom, a trafficking investigator, and Aidan McQuaid is the director of Anti-Slavery International. It's the oldest international human rights organization in the world. He joins us from London. Welcome to the stream, all of you. I'd like to start on my computer with a definition. This is from the International Labor Organization of forced labor. It refers to situations in which persons are coerced to work through the use of violence or intimidation, or by more subtle means, such as accumulated debt, retention of identity papers, or threats of denunciation to immigration authorities. Well, Ronnie, it's one thing to see a definition on the screen. It's another thing entirely to have it happen to you. Can you take us back, if you will, to this 7-year-old version of yourself? How did it feel to be taken from your home in Kerala, India?
You know, I was, born in southern part of India. And at the age of 7 is when a friend of the family said, hey, I can help this one child, give her a better education, give her food, and everything seemed to be just perfect. But in reality, so I went to this one location, and in reality, this woman who was running this shelter was in the business of selling children. She then sold, as a 7-year-old child, I was crying for my mom. But what happened is she sold me into slavery across the state border to where I did not know anybody. I didn't know the language. I was disoriented, and everything was unfamiliar to me. So as a 7, can you imagine? Many of us in the audience have 7-year-old little girls, and we need to do everything we can to protect them. So in my case, I became, my broker put me as destitute and dying because of the beatings and torture and the abuse that he did. So what he did for final is that he sold me for international adoption into Canada, Canada into the United States. We're talking about an illegal business, selling people for a profit.
And Rana, you mentioned the time when you left. You said your broker. You said so matter of fact, but I want to show a picture of how old you were at that time. This is the 8-year-old version of you. You can see the scabs, the marks on your legs, on your skin. How did it feel? Can you remember the thoughts that ran through your head as an 8-year-old?
You know, as an 8-year-old little girl, I could not understand what was happening. I mean, I was taught to trust adults, to obey adults.
Did you trust the woman who came to your house in the first place?
I did, because this is what happens in the trafficking industry. Somebody comes up and acts like they are the answer to the world. They pretend to have everything that you need in your time of vulnerability. And so in my case, I absolutely trusted this woman. In fact, she gave me candy. So what 8-year-old child would not trust somebody in the neighborhood who was being kind to her? But what we know today, this is a tactic that traffickers and recruiters use every single day. And in my case, this woman was the recruiter who was actually getting the ownership of the child so she can sell that child. And basically, she ruined my life.
Rana, just to follow up on that, essentially to give the audience a better sense of what actually, how this interaction happens between these traffickers and the parents. Kenneth here asks online, says, what promises or rewards did the traffickers say to convince your parents to essentially give you up? Can you tell us a little bit more about how that process goes down?
Okay, absolutely. So we're talking about vulnerability. So in my case, this woman just promised and said, I will do everything in my power to help your family. Let me help one of your children. So she gave false promises of, from food. They didn't feed me. You can tell by that picture. Starvation is a major part of this trafficking industry. This woman promised me that I would have the best life, and that was a false statement, and that is taking advantage of someone in their vulnerability.
Well, Jeff, as we heard, Ronnie was taken from India to Canada to the U.S. You yourself have conducted over 300 raids cross-country looking into this. Can you take us through a raid? What happens?
Yes, I've done several raids actually in India and down in the area where Ronnie is from, in Bangalore and in Tamil Nadu and those areas. Primarily we work with the forced and bonded labor situations. I recently did a raid there just about a year or so ago involving a brick kiln where a family was there, actually 3 generations of a family. They had been there for over 30 years. The husband was married and his wife was very sick, and so he went to a brick kiln owner, and for $200 of medical expenses, he bonded himself in to work for this brick kiln owner. For a $200 fee, he ended up working 30 years to try to repay back that debt. And during the process, he had a son and a grandson that were also enslaved at the time of the rescue and recovery. We conducted an investigation and were able to collect enough evidence to get the government to act. And there's a live footage of the raid and recovery operation we did. You can see the living conditions were just those huts with sticks thatched over it. The bricks laying out in the sun. The children, young as 5, 6, 7 years old, were also employed to actually stack and carry the bricks. And I believe I sent some pictures as well where you can actually see the hands of the kids that were all scarred up and mangled up because of the work that they're doing.
Jeff, how do you go about entering a country? How was it, what found you entering India? How did you hear about this? Can you take us through that process?
Yes, I was working with an NGO at the time, Human Rights NGO, International Justice Mission. And so we had offices down in those areas, and I had investigators working in those areas undercover, working to identify victims of slavery and trafficking, meeting with them, getting interviews, and collecting intelligence as well as evidence to be able to prove the case of trafficking. And so then we would work with the local government officials and come there with the government officials to bring the victims out, bring them to an inquiry where we can actually hear the evidence against the traffickers and to get them set free. All these individuals, these former slaves, were actually given certificates of freedom at the inquiry and set free, and then we assisted them in life with aftercare services and how to live as free men, because most of these people had never lived much of the day of their life in freedom, and so that's a big responsibility as well for organizations.
Jeff, do you know who the traffickers are? What's a profile of a trafficker?
There's I teach on how to identify trafficking and traffickers, and there's no real clear profile. They could be man or woman, and we're actually seeing a lot more women getting involved, because as Ronnie said, you go to a remote village, a man is less likely to be accepted and less likely to be trusted. Maybe it's an older woman, a motherly figure. I investigated a girl who was trafficked. She got on a train, and an older woman sat down next to her, an auntie, according to their culture, offered her a cup of tea, and she woke up in a position of exploitation. She was drugged. Other women come and they offer opportunities for education, for work, to take care and offer a better life. The ultimate goal is an opportunity for a better life outside of their current living conditions. And so the families are desperate and looking for opportunities for their children and are willing to send them off with these strangers.
So we put out the question to our community about why child trafficking actually happens, and we have Laura John here who says because traffickers find them the easiest to exploit, talking about young people. But we have MMA Aliyah here, who basically brings it back to the family, saying that because of lack of basic necessities in life, the child becomes a heavy burden to the parents. So Aidan, on that particular point, is there any work that happens in vulnerable communities to try to help parents basically not fall victim to this type of practice where they might lose their children?
There's probably some, but it's trivial. The amount in the broad scheme of things is trivial. If you look across the development practice, if you look across the anti-poverty movement across the world, it doesn't look at the issue of child labour in any sustained and systematic way. It doesn't look at the issue of trafficking, either adult or children, in any systematic or sustained way. One of the things which the international development community hasn't grasped is that trafficking, child labour, slavery, child slavery are fundamental development issues. Until one addresses the issue of slavery in the world, one's never going to end poverty. But if you look at either the Millennium Development Goals, which were drawn up in around 2000 in order to direct the efforts of the international community, if you look at what's proposed for the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, which is meant to direct the efforts of the international community after 2015, there is no significant acknowledgement of the fundamental issue of trafficking, child labour, child slavery, or adult slavery in this. So you have a whole body of institutions and organizations, from governments to international NGOs to local non-governmental organizations to local development projects and national development programs, just don't look at the issue of slavery, either adult or child, and consequently are doing very little to address it. There has been a reduction in child labour in the world. I think it's important to draw the distinction between child labour and child slavery.
And what is that distinction?
Child labour is essentially the family is putting the child to work under the age of 14, to work that is not either dangerous or dirty, or certainly not in their best interests. Child slavery is whenever a child is handed over to a third party for purposes of exploitation. So what Ronnie described is an issue very much of child slavery, not just child labour. Now, it's an important distinction because I think most people would believe that families who are exploiting have their children in child labour generally want to do what's right by their children. So the approach that one would take in order to end child labour is different from the approach that one would need to take in order to end child slavery, which is undertaken by people who are not the parents of the child and who frankly don't care one iota about what happens to the child. But neither of these things are getting addressed particularly well. There has been, it's estimated, a 1/3 reduction in child labour over the past 10 years, but there has been no reduction whatsoever in child slavery. In 2005, it was estimated child slavery was 5.5 million. In 2012, it's estimated that child slavery is 5.5 million.
Well, Aidan, and looking at reduction, because people watching this are going to want to know what they can do, I just want to give our viewers an idea of the scope of this. So on my laptop, I pulled up, this is a map. This is productsofslavery.org, and this was done in conjunction with your organization, Aidan. This shows the products that are made using child labor or forced labor. I'm hovering here. This is India. 18 different products come out of India. They range from locks, leather goods, gems, garments. This is something that affects so many of us, Ronnie. Even the clothes that I'm wearing today, many of them cotton, picked by young hands that probably shouldn't be out in the fields picking them. I know that I'm complicit in it, but what do I do?
Yeah, and this is a question because a lot of times much of the public believe, oh, slavery doesn't affect my life. Well, that's a misconception because we know we can see forced labor in the products that we use every day. We know that forced labor in the supply chains that children were being used in that labor to make that. The most commonly are the gold, the cotton, and coffee. These products are often produced far from where they are bought. We think, oh, it doesn't affect us. But its supply chains is very complex, right? We all agree on that, changing hands along the way. But the raw material that our products are made from have been touched by slaves. And that may shock some of us. And I think this is something we need to wake up to as a country and as a world, that every single day we are using products in our houses, in our offices, in our hands with technology that may have been tainted by former slaves. So today, I want to bring an answer to that. What can we do? And that is why I'm asking the audience, to let's act, let's get educated on this issue, but then let's start buying responsibly. Buy things from companies that are being responsible and that are being ethically sourced, so we are assured that that company who makes our clothing, the shoes that I wear, the shoes everyone on this wear, it is not being tainted by slavery. I want companies, I want these major corporations to take a stand and make a commitment to myself and to the millions of victims who have been in forced labor. I want companies to make a commitment to work with me to ending this trade.
So that lack of essentially consumer knowledge is obviously part of the problem that some of our community are tweeting in about. James here says, I doubt most consumers of said products are aware of their origin, pretty much the problem right there. But we also have Sheikh Rahmatullah here who says, consumers can coerce the producers of such goods to contribute revenue to the education of those children. So Jeff, what do you think of that idea? Is that breaking that relationship of exploited children is not enough? The people who exploited them should maybe be essentially helping to educate them? Is that something that...
Yeah, they should be not only charged criminally, but from the profits that they've been reaping off the backs of these slave laborers and the children in particular, they should be responsible for providing education and other services for them, and not just general education, but sustainable lifestyles, so they're less vulnerable to being re-trafficked or less vulnerable to living in a situation where they have no hope for the future. And so, yes, I believe that there should be some civil remedies in charge of putting together foundations or some kind of funds to help support children who've been recovered through trafficking.
Well, Aidan, is this easier said than done? I pulled up on my screen here. This is a tweet from Rob Hanna. He tweets about the profit of $150 billion annually from global forced labor. So clearly there is a market for it. But at the end of it, as you were saying, the root of this is poverty. How do you address that desperation?
It's poverty and it's politics. A lot of politicians, if you were to pick any politician at random and bring them on your show, they would be appalled beyond measure about the nature of slavery in the world. If you were to ask them to take concrete action against it, if you were to recommend, for example, that they make companies criminally liable for forced labor in their supply chain, they would not do that. I am concerned sometimes when people say we need to get consumers to buy responsibly, because the truth of the matter is there's a number of countries in the world, large countries, and there's a number of regions within those countries which are establishing for themselves competitive advantage against other countries on the backs of forced labor within those countries. So they're saying essentially to international businesses, come to our country, source from it, and the price of labour will be very low because we'll have this pool of forced labour within it that you can source from. Now, companies will do that, and in many ways the progress towards trade can be good for countries, can be good for the whole society, but there's large swathes of that society are being excluded from it, either because they're migrants or because they are, for example, within South Asia, Dalits or Muslims or other minorities within say India, who are subject to wider prejudice and in fact have no protection of rule of law within it. So it's a fundamental political question, this. When are politicians going to face up to the vested interests who are profiting from this? When are they going to grow some courage to act both nationally and internationally against this? Both extending criminal law, as Jeff suggested, but also extending their diplomacy and their aid programs so that they face these issues directly. Many politicians will extol Abraham Lincoln as being one of their heroes, but if you look at what Lincoln did in being prepared to rip his own country apart in order to try and end slavery against the trivial contributions which contemporary politicians are making in order to try and end slavery, it's a desperately poor comparison between contemporary politicians and some of those of the past.
Can I add something to that?
Rodney, please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, Aidan. I appreciate you bringing this up. And I agree with you. Yes, we need countries and country leaders to do something about this work. So in October of this last year, I went before the UN General Assembly and I brought this to their attention. And I said I needed these countries to implement the laws that prevent forced labor. But when I went before the UN, I absolutely said it needs to be part of the post-2015 agenda, right? At this point, they're looking at what can they do to put this in their agenda, and I asked them, this is a must. And so I also offered them my 3-point plan to eradicating slavery. And one of that way is by my Freedom Seal. We, the Trani Foundation, wanted to give something to companies, and so they can so they got to apply for our seal and say and commit to us they are not ending slavery. So
Ronnie, as you're speaking, I pulled up the seal here. Do you think that this will work? This is basically the same thing you would do for a diamond to show that it is not a blood diamond, so to speak. Are companies signing on to this?
Absolutely. Companies are interested because they know this is the next, they got to create the next generation of buyers. And today, our millennial generation is going to demand that these companies take a social responsibility, be socially conscious in their products and the way the products are made in their supply chain. So I believe this is going to be one of the fundamental principles that are really going to change the way we look at forced labor. So yes, companies are interested.
I want to go to Jeff right before we end with this, because Jeff, you are one of these people, you're one of these actors who is working almost single-handedly to end this and to eradicate this. How do you go on? Where do you find your inspiration to keep going?
There's always work to do. I mean, I've been in many cases where I was unable to actually rescue and recover victims, and those are what keep me going. As Ronnie and Aidan both pointed out, there needs to be strong legislation. But what I've come across in many countries, there's legislation in place. It's actually the enforcement of it. Getting the officials, the government officials, the law enforcement to act in an ethical manner to go after these traffickers, these trafficking networks, and even the organizations and agencies employing this slavery. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of money going on, and so being able to do that is very difficult.
And Jeffrey,
makes my job much more difficult.
Easier said than done. It is difficult, and that's where we're going to have to pick up in the post show, because that's all the time we have for the main show. Now, on our next show, on any given day, more than 15,000 informants are collecting information for the U.S. FBI. We'll be discussing a new Al Jazeera documentary about the world of informants and counterterrorism operations. Post show is next. Streams at aljazeera.com. We'll see you there. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. We're continuing our discussion on children trafficked into forced labor. Still with us, Ronnie Hong, a survivor of child trafficking, Jeff Blom, a trafficking investigator, Aidan McQuaid, director of Anti-Slavery International, and of course, co-host and digital producer Omar Badar. Omar, the community has lots to say about this, I know.
They're actually talking about the rehabilitation angle of all this. We have Rachel here who tweeted in to Ronnie asking her, in terms of agency, did you feel that aid agencies treated you more as a victim or a survivor? So she's kind of asking about the empowerment aspect of it. We also have a video comment here from India. Take a listen to this.
The rescue of child labor is meaningless without comprehensive rehabilitation. Rehabilitation of children rescued should be educational, psychosocial, medical, and it must end in reintegration into mainstream society.
So Ronnie, can you talk a little bit about the importance of rehabilitation for children who have undergone forced labor?
Absolutely. You know, I think this is one of the top priorities we should have, because as a former victim, I was so traumatized, so beaten, to the point that I looked destitute and dying. I mean, so I needed to, people to work with me, to rehabilitate me, to bring me back to, life. I stopped talking for a while. I stopped walking. I just simply couldn't function because of the abuse by somebody else who exploited me. So, as today, the Trani Foundation, we have empowerment programs. We realize there's a huge need to rehabilitate former victims as myself and as my husband. So today we ask for, we have programs for education. We also have programs for the arts. For a while, I wasn't really functional, but I did know how to play sports. And I really believe sports is a healing process. For in my story, I wasn't talking much, but what I did know is that I could kick a ball. And that simple kicking a ball, rehabilitation through sports and the arts was the thing that I believe that built my confidence, saying I am a human being. I have value and I have something to contribute. And that playing sports helped build my confidence to live life again and to come back and get reintegrated back into society. So absolutely, I ask for every viewers and every listeners to work on rescuing and restoring the former victims, such as myself.
And Jeff, as that video comment was playing, I saw you nodding your head. What's the youngest age of a child that you've rescued?
5 years old.
5 years old. So what happens after a rescue? What do you do with a 5-year-old? How do you rehabilitate a 5-year-old who's been forced to work?
Well, we will not actually go in and do a rescue and recovery operation unless there's a suitable organization that we can then partner with to bring the victims to for proper aftercare, counseling, educational purposes, and even medical purposes. So we will not go in and actually remove victims until we get able to partner with an organization that can provide those services. Once they get out, we work with them with the partnership to make sure, and actually during the investigation, I bring the aftercare workers in, look at the video, we start profiling the victims, we identify what some of the issues are, and we use some of the methods and counsel the victims while they're actually in positions of exploitation, so they can be prepared mentally and emotionally, so when they come out, there's less trauma on the recovery process, they're more successful in the aftercare programs and stay in it longer and see growth and able to be reintegrated into society.
So, Aidan, on the question of what could be done to try to alleviate the problem of child forced labor, we have a lot of reactions online for people with recommendations on what we should be doing. Ari Blaze just tweeted in during the show saying education should be made available and affordable to everyone. We have Yaya here who takes it a step further, saying that education should be compulsory and it should be completely free. But we also have Kofi here who says that the best thing to do is to prosecute the offenders to life sentences. And I kind of want to talk about sort of the prosecution end of that, the punitive part. I mean, when people are caught engaging in child trafficking for labor, what are the punitive measures like? I mean, are they sufficient deterrent, or is it not taken seriously enough?
They're generally good on paper, but I think as Jeff pointed out, they're very rarely applied particularly well. The enforcement and implementation of the law is usually quite poor. I think one of the things, though, is to be clear about is there's no silver bullet in this. There's not just one thing you can do which is going to solve the problem. You need to have portfolio of approaches. I think what both Jeff and Ronnie have described are very good examples of good approaches that can be taken. But in order to change the world, you need three things essentially: money, money, and money. Because these sort of approaches, which Jeff and Ronnie described, need to be brought to a much more considerable scale, much broader sets of law enforcement of trained police, much better, more extensive facilities for the rehabilitation of people who are have been in forced labour. Education is essential to this, but it's not just free and compulsory, it also needs to be appropriate. We've interviewed kids in West Africa who have been trafficked to cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire, and again they tell the same tragically banal story. Somebody came to our village, they told us if we went with them to Côte d'Ivoire, we would have easy work, we'd earn a lot of money, and we'd be able to buy ourselves a bicycle. The sort of dreams that most kids have. One needs to put in place the sort of education where those kids can see, if they continue through their education, there's a prospect that they can earn for themselves, rather than being distracted from it and taken away with some other prospect. So education around vocational skills, education around entrepreneurship as well. And that's something which we're not seeing in a whole swathe of the curriculums across the global south. And that's also fundamental. One needs to start building the agency of kids from an early age so that they can see a better prospect for themselves if they stay at home and stay in school.
As we're building this agency, we're looking around the world and we do see glimmers of inspiration, but then there are also countries like Bolivia. What does it do to Bolivia's cause, where it's been legalized for children under the age of 10 to work?
I think it's a great pity. Bolivia is saying we're facing up to this fact that lots of kids in Bolivia work, but I think in lowering the age of employment, legal age of employment within Bolivia, what they're saying to Bolivian society is it's okay to use child labour. So I think there's going to be a consequence of that, which will be many more kids go into child labour. They say there is protections for this, but there's not the capacity in Bolivian society or in Bolivian government in order to implement those protections. But I think that's also an indictment of the international community. If Bolivia is saying we have no prospect of ending child labour in our country because of a variety of factors, and if we keep this law on the books it will become a laughingstock, that is Bolivia also saying to the world, you have failed our development project, you have failed our anti-poverty project. One needs to put back in place engagement with Bolivia, diplomatic and aid-wise, which is going to put child labour eradication at the centre of that programme, and which isn't going to tolerate the sort of erosion of rights which the Bolivian government has unfortunately done. Well-meaning politicians have done this sort of thing in the past.
Right.
Alexander Hamilton, for example, proposed it in the United States in the 1790s. But history has shown that one needs robust legislation which is robustly enforced against child labour in order to eradicate it, and any other approach has not worked.
Ronnie, in our last minute of our program here, before we get the closing thoughts from the community, July 30th, you'll be in Colombia. What will you be doing?
Absolutely. So so July 30th is our very first World Day Against Trafficking in Person. I went before the UN General Assembly to ask for this day, and later in the year, December, they passed a resolution to create awareness on this event, but on this day, but also take action. I will be traveling to Colombia, working with the Ministry of Interior, UNODC, different organizations, saying we as survivors were important, just like your daughters, your children. And I will be going there with a conference, one of our first international conference of survivors. These are survivors who are standing up and saying, we are leaders. We're more than our stories. We're part of the solution.
Ronnie, is there a hashtag that our community can follow to follow along what you're doing on July 30th? Absolutely. Please follow I Give Hope campaign. So that's hashtag I Give Hope. It's a campaign, a global campaign that I am running in partnership and collaboration with UNODC. We'll
so
tweet
please
that out.
follow us, and everybody start tweeting and raising awareness on this issue, because this is important to not to only myself, but I speak for those without a voice. And today there are millions of children, like the little girl I was, that was isolated, beaten, and starved. And so today we have that opportunity to change that system around for the little girl I was. So please, carry my voice, join the hashtag, and help raise the visibility of this issue, especially on July 30th of 2014.
That's Ronnie Hung. You also heard from Jeffrey Blum and Aidan McQuaid. Ending thoughts from the community, Omar?
We have Kristen on Facebook who's just expressing her general frustration with the issue of forced child labor. She says, how greedy must any company or person be to do this to a child? There is no excuse for this, none. I am sick of everything boiling down to money. But on a more upbeat note, we have Michelle here, who actually tweeted into Ronnie, saying, I don't have a question, but thanks for giving a voice to all the victims. God bless you. You are an angel.
We'll be looking for those tweets on July 30th, as you can as well on Home Now. Just enough time to tell you what's going to happen on Thursday's show. Any given day, more than 15,000 informants are collecting information for the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We'll be discussing a new Al Jazeera documentary about the world of FBI informants and counterterrorism operations. Until then, we'll see you online.